Well, we're back in the second message, in fact, in this new series on Esther, a woman, a queen under control. And as I studied this week, something began to kind of resonate in my thinking of another situation in the Bible. It had to do with Joseph. Remember Joseph? And I saw a parallel between Joseph and Esther. You remember Joseph, he was rejected by his brothers. They wanted to kill him, but they thought, well, it's probably not a good idea. And then so he was sold to a group of vagabonds. And basically his life was anything but that which you would expect, being the son of Jacob. As he began to kind of gain influence, what happened? Well, with Potiphar's wife, she accused him of seducing her, and so he got thrown into jail. And then he gives an interpretation to the baker of a dream that the baker had, and he says, and of course it was correct, and the baker said, I will remember you, which he didn't remember him. And so he stayed in prison for 3 years. But finally, he was elevated to next in command, next to Pharaoh in Egypt. And finally, his brothers, during the famine, they come to Egypt, and he recognizes his brothers who have rejected him, but they didn't recognize him. But as he's talking to them, as you know, without going through the whole story, he says, once they realize who he is, and they begin to kind of like, it's curtains for us. He basically said, just chill. He said, because you meant it for evil. Let's read that verse. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive, namely, to preserve God's people, the Hebrew people. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What we see in this situation in the study of the book of the life of Esther is that we see a lot of carnal people. We see a lot of evil stuff going on around her. Nonetheless, God uses that stuff to bring about His program, to bring about His providence in the life of not only Esther and Mordecai, but in all of His people, to preserve His people, in fact. That's what we see today in Esther chapter 2. We see that, we see her rise to prominence, much like Joseph had risen. And we see that God strategically had brought her to prominence for that very purpose, so that God's people would be protected and preserved. And as we see her rising to prominence, we think first and foremost that she rises to prominence based upon her looks, and that's perhaps that which opened the door. But as we dig deeper and look closer into the context and between the lines and read between the lines, we see that it was more than just looks that elevated Esther. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to walk through this chapter. Where this is a narrative. We normally go verse by verse, but when you when you approach a narrative, sometimes you take a different approach. We're going to walk through this narrative. We're going to see the drama unfold. But then at the end of this narrative, after we've done that, we're going to look at 4 things that shine through in the life of Esther that set her apart as different. Just like Joseph was set apart because of who he was, we see this with Esther. Let's turn in our Bibles to Esther chapter 2. Esther's in the Old Testament, right before Job, right after Nehemiah. It may take you a little bit to get there. When we left you 2 weeks ago, King Ahasuerus of Persia had become I love allergies, don't you? King Ahasuerus of Persia had become so angry with this queen for not making an appearance before him, and of course all the drunken officials of Persia at that time. And so what does he do? He listens to the advice of his advisors, I guess. And they said, you need since she won't do that, you should banish her. You should get rid of her. How can a woman do that? And if you let her get away with that, then what's going to happen? Then all the wives in Persia are going to do the same. In fact, there's some extra biblical information out there that Memucan, who was one of his advisors, that he had problems at home. And so he was the one who really pushed this through. And there's a belief that he did that partly because he had a bias as well. Well, again, he listens to his counselors, and he does that. They set up this beauty pageant and bring in these young virgins to participate from all over the empire, to search far and wide. And 2 weeks ago, we noticed that the name of God is not mentioned in this book. Yet when Esther arrives on the scene, it is clear that God is orchestrating every event. Today we see that God is using the deposing of Queen Vashti as a means of protecting his people through Esther. Here's a lady who is in obscurity, and now she rises to queen with this great influence. And Esther's appointment would be just the first step in God's plan for protecting his people from their enemies. Through it all, he will reveal to his people that he has not forgotten them in exile, and that he is still intimately concerned about them. Jeremiah 29, we'll go there later. In Jeremiah 29, we see the promise that God, even though his people are in exile, God has not forgotten them. God will remember them. So how does this drama unfold? That's the question before us. And let's just walk through it. First, we see the plan to select the queen, verses 1 through 4. Let's read verse 1. It says, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The events in this passage took place approximately 479 BC, probably during the latter portion of the king's ill-fated war with Greece. You may remember we mentioned that. And it unfolded over a period, that battle and that conflict unfolded over a period of 4+ years. And it says, when the wrath of Ahasuerus had subsided. Although it's not expressed explicitly, this verse seems to imply that Ahasuerus regretted his response to his wife Vashti. He remembered what she had meant to him, but now there's no turning back. The law would forbid him to turn back. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus was a Jewish historian, not a believer, but a great historian of the first century. He said this. He says, now although the king was in love with her, Vashti, and could not bear the separation, he could not, because of the law, be reconciled to her, so he continued to grieve at not being able to obtain his desire. It would seem, too, in this context, that the response of the king's servants intimate that, again, Ahasuerus regretted what he had done. In verse 2, it says, then the king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Persian kings had the right to claim young women as an addition to their harem, which amounted to a collection of concubines. It was customary for each woman to undergo a full year of spiritual beauty treatment, training, purification rites prior to becoming a part of the king's harem. They enjoyed royal privileges and status, and they were housed separately from everybody else in the palace. Reading on in verse 3, it says, let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be the queen in place of Vashti. And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly. Now it says they were placed under Haggai. Who is Haggai? He is, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, he was an officer of Xerxes. Xerxes is another name for King Ahasuerus. He was a eunuch, and of course eunuchs were commonly trusted with the care of the women and the concubines because they were not a threat, obviously, of sexual mistreatment of the women. But I want you to note in verse 4 the phrase, the young lady who pleases. In the literal Hebrew text, it reads, who pleases the eyes of the king. Who pleases the eyes of the king. Now, everything at this point appeared to have nothing to do with the people of God. An arrogant Gentile king has become drunken. He has thrown this 6-month bash. He has marital problem. He gets rid of his wife. He sends out a search party to find a beautiful new queen. Yet these events started a chain reaction that would lead to the potential destruction of God's people, followed by an amazing 11th hour deliverance through God's providence. God is sovereign, and his providence is the way through which God weaves events together behind the scenes so that his sovereignty over the world is carried out. Even though God is not mentioned, his breathtaking providence in her life and on behalf of his people couldn't be more obvious. One of the things you want to see here is that God works through the mundane. We often look for God to work through the miraculous, and he does that as well. But God works through the mundane, and not only that, he works among even the pagans, the carnal people. Clearly, that's what he did here. Some of you may be living in situations and you think all these people who are around you are worldly people, perhaps pagans that have no inclination, no desire to know God. And you think, how can God put me in a place? How can he move in this situation to put me where I'd love to be? You probably have seen the placard that says, how can you soar among eagles when you work among turkeys? You ever seen that placard before? Well, I want to tell you, God can even work among the turkeys to move about and to bring about his providence. And that's what you see. And that's one of the reasons that Esther is included, is canonized with the Bible, with the rest of the books in the Bible. Because you see the providence of God. Clearly God's hand is on this situation. And so it is a book of encouragement, as I just pause here for a moment, to remind you that God works behind the scenes. And remember Habakkuk cried out to God and said, God, why aren't you doing something? And essentially what God said to Habakkuk, you're looking in the wrong direction. I'm already working. I'm already moving among you, your people. You just don't, what you're expecting is not the way I'm going to do it. God does that in our lives as well. In verses 5 and 6, we see the introduction of Mordecai. Let's read verses 5 and 6. When Haman saw that, back up, chapter 2. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives, who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. Now, it's worthy to point out that the literal Hebrew wording here reads, it really emphasizes, in fact, his Jewishness, because it reads, a Jewish man was in Susa, the citadel, and his name was Mordecai. Anytime it takes that and puts that at the front of a sentence, it's emphasizing. It's making an emphasis for a reason. So you ask the question, how did these Jews get to Persia. And, of course, it alludes to the fact that they were carried off to Babylon. But how did they get to Persia? Well, let's back up and let me just give you the big picture for just a moment. Many years before Esther's story begins, the Jews had a civil war, much like our nation had a civil war. And they were divided. Just like our nation, they were divided between the north and south. The Jewish north was referred to as Israel. The southern portion of that was referred to as Judah. Most of the kings in both those kingdoms did not walk with God, at least not consistently. Eventually, God judges the people in the northern kingdom because of their stubborn unfaithfulness by sending the Assyrians up against them. And as a result of the Jews of the northern kingdom, their disobedience, and God took them into bondage, or allowed them to be taken into bondage by the Assyrians. Well, more than 100 years later, God brought judgment, a very similar judgment, to the Jews in the southern kingdom because of their disobedience. And so, and Jeconiah, who was at that time known as Jehoiachin, was a young king of Judah who reigned in 597 BC. He wore his crown only for 3 months when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah, deported Jeconiah, and he also took the temple treasures. 11 years later, 586 BC, with a vicious blow, he just demolished Jerusalem. And there he led the Jews into captivity. Later, the Babylonians fell to the Medo-Persian people, the empire, in 539 BC. So King Ahasuerus became king of Persia around 485, 486, some debate there, 100 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So the book of Esther is a slice of history from those people who were taken exile. Basically, the book of Esther is 12 years of that history. Mordecai was a descendant of one of those exiled Jews. In fact, he was a fourth generation descendant of the initial Jews that were led into captivity. He was a godly man, and he was the uncle of Esther, who was an orphan. Now, in verse 7, we read, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Hadassah means myrtle tree. The myrtle tree became a symbol of the Jewish people. Esther comes from either the Persian word star or from the name of the Babylonian goddess, Ishtar. And it states that Esther was beautiful in form and face. The literal Hebrew reads just a bit different, and there's a reason why I want to highlight this. The Hebrew reads, she was lovely in form and features. In form and features. More about that later. Now, as we get to verse 9, we see the encouragement of Haggai. So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. Now note verse 9. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him. By the way, that found favor is literally found kindness. She found kindness with him. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food. And the word, by the way, food, can also be translated from the Hebrew portions. So it's clear here that he is giving her more than what normally is given or was given to these ladies. He gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Now, just as Joseph found favor in Egypt, just as Daniel found favor in Babylon, so Esther finds favor here in Susa or Shushan. The text does not explain precisely why he favored Esther, but it does imply that she earned a preferred position on the basis of something more than physical beauty. And as a result, as we see here, Haggai favored her, and he gave her more than what she normally would benefit from in this process. Now, one thing, too, I want you to note, it says that here that it uses the words "were taken." The words "were taken" is Hebrew passive tense. It's in the Hebrew passive tense, which could be translated, by scholars agree, that it could be translated that she was, the words taken by force. It insinuates that she went somewhat against her will. Now, I'm not saying she was resistant to it, but I think it is fair to say that Esther was reluctant to leave her family and go do what they were about to do. Think about it. Why would a Jewish girl want to leave her family and be shut away in some harem for life, if indeed she did not become queen? Now, in verses 10 and 11, we see that Esther hid her nationality, her ethnicity. Now, why'd she do that? Well, I think there's 2 or 3 reasons why. One reason was given by the Greek historian Herodias, who stated that only daughters of noble Persian families could become a queen. Being a Jew would eliminate her from such. Now, as we move on, keep moving here, we see the approval of the king in verses 12 through 14. It says, "Now when the turn of each young lady came to go in to the king, Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and cosmetics for women. Then the young lady would go in to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace." Now, these verses describe the process by which the virgins were prepared and were presented to the king. And once they went through a year of preparation, it says they will go into the king. Now, that's a euphemism. That wasn't to go in and say, "Hello, take a look." No, it meant that she would go and would sleep with the king that night. She would spend the night with him. And keep in mind that he had a new virgin every night. Essentially, each woman in the king's beauty pageant was sentenced to a life of unfulfilled loneliness if she wasn't chosen by the king to be a queen, which helps to understand why Esther had some hesitation, I would suggest. In fact, it's estimated that the king, Ahasuerus, likely consorted with 1,000 virgins prior to meeting Esther. 1,000 virgins. Now, verse 15, it states that each woman was allowed to take with her whatever she wished from the palace that she thought would bring the king great pleasure. She could also take whatever she wanted that she wanted to keep. Esther only took what Haggai had suggested. In other words, she turned down an opportunity to pile up material things for herself. Esther was different. She was unlike any other of the women, I'm sure. And as a result, she set herself apart from all the other people. And other people, including Haggai, took notice. Now listen. Much in Esther's story that is happening was inconsistent with God's character. But the Jews were God's covenant people, and he had promised to cover them. He had promised to protect them. So Esther won more favor, more approval than the other women because God's hand was upon her, but also because she walked with God. She was mentored by Mordecai. Mordecai, who was a godly man, and she followed him and she listened to him. And thus, she was set apart by her demeanor, by her countenance, by her heart, by her attitude. And I have to believe that Esther understood God's promise that he would not abandon his people in exile, that he would indeed one day deliver them. I want you to hold your place and turn over to Jeremiah chapter 29. Turn back to Jeremiah, forward to Jeremiah chapter 29. Can't read the whole section, but I want to read just a few verses. Jeremiah 29. In verse 1 and 2, it says, "Now these are the words of the letter which Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders of the exile, the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Verse 2 says, "This was after Jeconiah and the queen mother, the court officials, the princes of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen, and the smiths had departed from Jerusalem." Now, in verse 3, it tells how that letter was delivered. Verses 4 through 8, 9 is God's instruction to the people in exile, how they are to live as godly people. But when you get to verse 10, here's what God says to them. "For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good words to you, to bring you back to this place, to bring you back to this place." Now here's a verse that you hear over and over, and people quote it. Let's read it. "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek my face and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes, and will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from where I sent you into exile." I have to believe there's some debate as to when this letter went out. And you can go back to Esther. There's some debate as to the dating of this letter, dating of Jeremiah for that matter, but particularly this letter. And but we know that it was sometime after 597 BC that it went to the people. But I have to believe that if Mordecai and Esther did not read this specific promise, they had to know of some promise of God's restoring the people of Israel. You see, again, it points to God's providence, how God in his providence has his hand on his people. We don't talk a lot, you don't hear people talk a lot about God's providence, other than when something happens, we say, well, that's God's providence, perhaps. I want to read to you what Tony Evans, this is not will not be on the data projector, how Tony Evans defines providence. He really gets the cookies down on the lower shelf. Providence is the hand of God in the glory of history. It is a work of God whereby he integrates, blends events in the universe in order to fulfill his original design for which it was created. So listen to this. It is God sitting behind the steering wheel of time. It is God sitting behind the steering wheel of time. Providence refers to God's governing of all events so as to direct them towards an end. It is God taking what you and I would call, now listen to this, it is God taking what you and I would call luck, chance, mistakes, happenstance, and stitching them into achieving his program. And I would suggest to you that God still does that in each of our lives, even when we don't believe that he's working behind the scenes. In verses 19 through 23, we see the rescue of the king. It says, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her people. Commanded her people there. And it goes on to talk about Mordecai is saved by the fact that Ahasuerus is saved as Mordecai overhears a conversation at the gate. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but as Mordecai is at the gate, he hears these eunuchs, officials of Ahasuerus, plotting against Ahasuerus. And so what does he do? He tells Esther about this plot. Esther tells King Ahasuerus. And of course, he is rescued there. Now, as you read in this passage here, and in fact, to look at verse 23, it says, "Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on gallows." And by the way, the Persians are thought to have been some of the first to create or invent crucifixion, the hanging or the driving or impaling people with nails on a tree. That's a literal translation of this. But what you have to get here that's important for a future reference is that the last verse, in the last section, it says, "It was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence." Now, the king forgot all about it. Mordecai was never rewarded, nor was he even recognized. But later on, that's going to play a huge part in the process of God's providence in these events. Well, here's the question. What characteristics of Esther shine through in her rise to the position of queen? Well, let me give you four. I think there are four that shine through. Actually, I think there are more than that, but I just want to give you four. Esther was a woman full of grace-filled elegance. Esther was a woman full of grace-filled elegance. And I realize that sentence is somewhat redundant, but I wrote it on purpose that way. The literal translation here in the Hebrew is that she lifted up grace before his face. She lifted up grace before his face. Even though she was brought to this harem, and particularly reluctant perhaps, she did not display a sour attitude. Apparently she sensed God moving in all of this, in her place in this, that God was using her. Esther, I think, modeled graceful elegance before the king's servant, Haggai. Her demeanor, her countenance, obviously were far different than any of the other women. Her inner qualities could not be ignored from the one who had basically brought her, prepared her for the king. Think of this. In this place, there was everything imaginable on cultivating central techniques on attracting the lonely king's eyes and heart. But Esther remained Esther. She lifted up grace. And I'm convinced that there was something different about her countenance. There was something different about her attitude that caught Haggai's attention. There was a demeanor that perhaps was different. Have you ever come across the people who you don't know them, and yet you know there's something different about them? And there's all a connection sometimes. And you don't know that they're a Christian, but you think immediately, this person's different. I wonder if they're a Christian. Have you ever felt that, sensed that? Sure you have. There's something about the countenance of the believer who's walking with God, as it was with Esther. I think of David, actually. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 12, it says, "And he sent and brought him in," him being David. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Now I chose the King James translation here because in the other translations it only speaks of him being handsome. This uses the word countenance. And I think some of the translators miss the meaning of the Hebrew in that context there, because I believe that David, this young shepherd boy, had a countenance that was different from all the others. Think of that great benediction by Aaron, the prayer, who said, "The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his," said, "countenance upon you and give you peace." What does that verse tell us? That verse tells us that when God when he's working in our lives and he brings his countenance in our lives, there will be peace. And people take note of peace in others. The second thing I think of here and I see is Esther exhibited unusual restraint and control. I see this in a couple of areas. Number one, she didn't, when they said you can take whatever you want to from the palace to the king, she didn't back up the dump truck and load up. But also, I see it in the fact that she didn't tell anyone who she was. She didn't go around talking about and bragging about who she was. Why? Because Mordecai told her not to do that. But I see a lot of restraint demonstrated by Esther in all of this, because one thing that she demonstrates is a quiet spirit. Verbal restraint is fast becoming a forgotten virtue, is it not? Thanks to the tell-all tabloids and the hide-nothing television talk shows, nothing is restrained, right? And what's the hardest thing for us to do sometimes is to restrain our lips. When I get in trouble, it's usually when I've said something that I shouldn't say. In Timothy, Paul speaking to this young Timothy, the second book, chapter 1, he says, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power, love, and discipline." Some translations say sound mind, but the idea of the Greek word there is of control, self-control. God has not given us a spirit of fear. Fear is contrary to self-control. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, turn over there real quickly. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25, it says, "For everyone who competes in the games exercise self-control in all things. Then they do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. But I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." And I wonder how many of us oftentimes get in trouble because we do not control our tongue. We do not have a quiet spirit. Someone has said once, many times perhaps, sometimes the best answer is silence. The third thing I see about Esther is that she displayed no ambition for worldly fame and things. I added the word things. Think of it. She had the potential of no job, no responsibility, no cooking, no cleanup, no washing, no ironing, no errands, no budget watching. She had a bottomless checkbook, credit cards, no holding back in any area. All the jewelry, all the clothing, all the perfumes, all the cosmetics that she could ever want would be hers. And yet, what'd she do? She didn't care about any of that. Keep in mind that Esther can't be more than 20 years of age, probably, perhaps even younger. It would be easy for a young lady to be, in her immaturity perhaps, to lust for such things. But I'm convinced that she was discipled and led by Mordecai, a godly man, and her response was a godly response in all of these things. It's unbelievable about this young woman, what she did. And personally, I think Esther went into the king without fear because she had no driving ambition to be the queen. Her life did not evolve around her physical appearance of making the king happy. She was there for one reason, because she knew that God had his hand upon her. And keep in mind, she doesn't have the foggiest idea of the things that are about to transpire in the palace. And here's the fourth. Esther modeled a humble respect for godly wisdom and authority. She modeled a humble respect for godly wisdom and authority. Most people today, especially young people today, seem to think that when you marry, you no longer need to remember or to seek parental advice or counsel. Even the advice, especially the advice of older godly people. Too many seek out the counsel of others. I've told the story about someone who told me about there was in this support group, this therapy group, and they asked, he said, my counselor tells me one thing and my pastor tells me another, and I'm confused. And they said, so their response to him was, what do you want to do? That's why you're in the support group. You don't want to do what you want to do. No, she was a woman who listened to the counsel of godly, specifically one godly older person. The Bible is replete with seeking out the wisdom of those who are older. Job 12 says, wisdom is with aged men, with long life is understanding. Job 32 verse 6 says, so Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, spoke out and said, I am young in years and you are old. Therefore I was shy and afraid to tell you what I think. I thought age should speak and increased years should teach wisdom. One of the sad things today I think we see in our churches, and I understand this, I get this, I understand why our young people want to be with young people, young adults want to be with young adults. But the sad thing about that is that they are not recognizing the importance of older, godly wisdom in their lives. I am convinced of this, that Debbie and I missed a lot of heartache. We were averted great heartache at times because right after we were married and before we were married, we spent time with the older people, the leaders of the older people in the church who were godly and wise. We just drilled them and drilled them and drilled them and drilled them. And one of them would come down to where we were in college on one of his routes, and we'd have a Bible study, but we'd ask him question after question after question. In fact, we even went to one of them and said, we're about to get married. What do you think? You think we should get married? Don't underestimate the importance of seeking out godly wisdom. There's a lot of older people, I shouldn't say a lot of older, but a lot of mature people, godly people here that can give great advice if you ask them. Seek it out. Now, how do we apply that? Well, I would say this today. Which of those characteristics of Esther, whether you be male or female, which of those characteristics is most needed in your life? Which is most needed in your life? And let me just say today, if you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, we're in the Old Testament, no doubt, but if you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, then all of this will not make sense. Esther, Mordecai were people after God's heart, and they made a difference, and God used them, and God can use you, and He can move among the mundane in your life if your heart is right with Him.